Throughout the course of history, there are many dates in which many important events can and will happen. Today we'll be looking at one particular event and explore the possibilities that would have turned out had this event failed. This event happened about 68 years ago on the 6th of June, back in 1944. This event was a military operation, an invasion, and to this day it is still known as the largest amphibious invasion known to man. It was known by many names: Operation Overlord, Operation Neptune, the Battle of Normandy, the Normandy beach invasions, but ultimately known as D-Day. Before we start looking into what could have happened, let's rewind and look at the operation itself. After Allied forces were kicked off of the beaches of Dunkirk, we were left out of the war in Europe. We still had the Red Army in the Eastern Front and joint British and American forces fighting in North Africa and Italy, but these battles weren't enough to get us into the heartland of the Axis powers, Germany. We needed to open up another front to fight the Nazis with, to occupy Axis land somewhere other than Italy or Eastern Europe. We needed to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied France by sending Allied armies onto beaches named Juno, Gold, Sword, Utah, and Omaha. The Canadian forces landed on Juno Beach. British forces stormed Gold and Sword, while the American Army was responsible for Utah and Omaha. A lot of really careful planning went into the making of this operation. Most importantly, the famed Phony War in northern England. In order to trick German surveillance of the Allies, they set up a base in northern England where they stationed dozens of inflatable tanks. Every morning, they would go out and create false tank tread marks to make it look as though the tanks were driving around the base while blasting out the sounds of tanks, jeeps, and soldiers on the move from radios. All this to make the Axis powers think the Allies were mobilizing soldiers in northern England in an attempt to invade France somewhere north of Normandy. The Germans fell for it and began to fortify sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall more in the north than they did in Normandy. But Normandy was still heavily fortified as it was still part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, searching from the most northern point of Norway to the most southern point of France. This operation was an extremely complex one as it involved 156,000 soldiers coming from infantry units and airborne units alike. D-Day was delayed many times due to weather, but on the 5th of June, Eisenhower gave the go command and the Allies went on their way, by first sending in the airborne. On June 5, 1944, after Eisenhower gave the okay for Operation Overlord to begin, the airborne divisions received word of the start of the operation and began loading up into their planes to leave for France. At about 1 to 2 a.m. on June 6th, the American and British airborne forces flew over their designated drop zones in France. They first began to drop a special unit of airborne soldiers dubbed as Pathfinders. The jobs of the Pathfinders were to locate designated drop zones that are to be used by preceding airborne regiments and mark these drop zones for pilots to see. The purpose was to make sure that no airborne man gets misdropped. However, the Pathfinder's presence eventually alarmed the Germans, and soon the skies lit up with searchlights, flak, and anti-aircraft. Along with sudden German resistance and weather problems, miscommunication led to severe misdrops for all the airborne divisions. This rendered most of the Pathfinder's jobs useless, as people were dropped anywhere from 1 to 10 miles off target. All in all, 45% of all men in the airborne that were dropped over France were misdropped. Even though there were misdrops, soldiers of the airborne units regrouped and began to take their objectives, which at the time were to destroy any and all big guns that could serve as a hazard for soldiers landing on Utah Beach and clearing roads and villages behind the beaches to make life a bit easier for the infantry that just landed on the beaches. Which brings us to the next phase, the amphibious invasions. At approximately 5 a.m., all 5 beaches began to see action from the Allied invaders. Infantrymen were lowered into LCUs and Higgins boats, which in turn took them to the edge of the beaches, lowered their ramps, and let the soldiers run out. Due to artillery, many boats could not make it to the edge of the beaches, and many soldiers were dropped into deep parts of the beaches, stepping off the landing crafts into 6 to 7 foot deep, icy cold water. Equipped with all their extremely heavy gear, many soldiers sank down to the bottom and drowned, while the lucky ones stripped themselves of their gear and went through ill-equipped. During all this chaos, there were German mortars raining down on the men, with German MG-42s hailing them with bullets, tearing into ranks upon ranks of men. Nonetheless, these men pushed through, climbed over seawalls and over their obstacles, fought off the German defenders, and in the end were able to establish the foothold needed. Now that we know some of the specifics in the aftermath of D-Day, let's explore what would have happened had D-Day failed. Let's see what could have happened had all the airborne divisions failed their duties, the Germans knew exactly where we were landing, and further increased their defenses. Let's look and see what would have happened if every last man storming the Norman beaches was killed and nobody else was left, resulting in the loss of about 156,000 men in the matter of about 5 hours. First, let's look at the consequences that would have been directed towards the leaders. In case Operation Overlord failed, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had prepared a short speech for such an occurrence. He later stored it in his wallet, hoping to forget about it, but nonetheless, it goes as follows. Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery could do. If any blame or faults attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. This message would be broadcast on radios across America, Canada, England, and pretty much any other Allied country. German radios could have easily intercepted the speech for propaganda purposes. The fact of the matter is that Eisenhower would pretty much have no credibility anymore due to such a massive failure of a key operation. Perhaps high members of the brass might understand a failure every now and then is all but imminent, but civilians everywhere would have no faith in him, which would eventually lead to the loss of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, himself, a major loss during the time of war. This brings us to the next issue, morale. The sudden loss of so much life would decimate any and all morale of the citizens of the United States, Canada, and Britain. The citizens of the nations involved will most definitely have a negative outlook on the war because of this loss of life, and most likely not support the war as much as they did before. People working in the factories might have thought that it was pointless to fight a losing war, and the Allied war effort will slowly start to deplete, and over time, that rate will grow larger and larger. Eventually, even the soldiers who will have to deploy will lose interest, and the United States and other Allied countries will secede from the war. As a side note following morale, the Germans and all the Axis powers would take this newfound win and use it for propaganda. All of a sudden they will feel strength, for their country just repelled the largest amphibious invasion known to man, which in turn would greatly increase German morale, and more people would be encouraged to be a part of the war effort. Even German soldiers would become more feisty and resistant. Moving on, we have to look at the greatest factor that can possibly be looked at. Remember, earlier on in this video, it was said that the war was won less than a year after D-Day. Obviously, this wouldn't have happened, and the war in Europe would have continued for a few years more. The war wouldn't have ended in 1945, and we would have lost more soldiers. When you look at this in more detail, it starts to come together. We lose 156,000 men, and we have no foothold in France. All we have to rely on is that the Russians push through German lines into Berlin, or our boys in North Africa and Italy pull through and push through Europe. After that, we would again have to try to invade Europe, but now that we've already tried and failed, the Nazis would see another attack coming and would spare no expenses in defending and fortifying possible invasion zones, so a second invasion would be harder to accomplish, not to mention that it would be hard to get approved, with the last great loss in civilian approval would be at a minimum. Along with that, we would be losing more lives throughout the war. The Allied forces already lost 156,000 soldiers, along with losses from the next invasion and fighting the rest of the war, which now also has extra-resistant German fighters from the new morale boost after the earlier failed invasion. This would all easily spell doom for many a foot soldier. Now that we've looked at some of the consequences, we can easily say that had D-Day failed, we would have seen a greater loss of life in the war and an increase in German defenses. The war would have droned on for much longer than it actually did, and who knows, we may have actually lost the war in Europe given the circumstances regarding morale and loss of able-bodied men. All in all, the war would have taken a turn for the worse had D-Day failed, and we had never held those beaches in Normandy. The now stronger German war machine would then invade the weakened country of England, occupy it, then use their long-range V-2 rockets directly on the United States, forcing us out of the war, and would then lead us to be occupied by both Japan and Germany, splitting us into East and West, kind of like Germany was after World War II. But since we're closer to Japan, we'd be ruled under Japanese rulership right now, while the other side would be governed under Nazism. Seems pretty legit, doesn't it?